Hey guys, my name is Soaches, and today we're gonna be building the Snatcher from A Hat in Time. It also works as a pen holder.
When I first played A Hat in Time, I was really excited because I'd been waiting for its release for several years, and what I can say is that I really like this game. I might even go so far as to say that it's now one of my favorite games of all time, so making something from it was sort of bound to happen eventually. The Snatcher also seems to be a favorite among fans, including myself, so this felt like a good place to start. I'm starting off by using steel wire as the base for the body, which I then covered in aluminum foil to give it the right shape. As you can see, I'm also adding a thin layer of paper mache, which is just to make the clay easier to apply. I'm using an air drying paper based clay, which works really well with the stuff I normally do, but for more detailed work like small figurines, it can be pretty hard to use as it runs the risk of becoming too fragile. This is also part of the reason as to why I haven't made any characters on this channel before, but because the Snatcher happens to be pretty big, it wasn't that much of a problem. I was initially going for the pose the character has in the title card for the boss battle, which is why he's standing pretty straight compared to the kind of twitchy movements he usually has in the game. Alright, this is what it looks like after some drying and sanding. The head ended up a bit too small, so I'm gonna go back and fix that later, but right now I'm gonna move on to the neck piece. As you can see, I'm using a piece of paper as the base for the neck piece, which is sort of supposed to look like a jester color that blends in with the rest of his body. At least I assume it's a part of his body and not a piece of clothing, because I don't know why a ghost would want to wear clothes, or why his priority would be getting a jester color and not a pair of pants. Also, finding a tailor to make something that big would be okay. I had to check a couple of different sizes for the spikes, each time putting the piece back on to see if it looked okay before I started working with the clay. I honestly didn't expect this to work as well as it did on my first try. I thought I would have to try again or come up with something else. I think the hardest part was finding a place for it to dry, since the spikes are supposed to be pointing in specific directions, and wet paper isn't the easiest material to try to set in a fixed position. Now I'm adding some glue to the inside of the collar, and this is more just to keep it in place while I cover the surrounding areas with clay. It's not a 100% perfect fit, so I'm jamming some toothpicks between the gaps to make sure it doesn't fall off before the glue dries. The clay here on the bottom should lie flat against the bottom of the piece, so basically I'm just filling in the gaps. This means I have to use a knife later after the clay dries to scoop out any excessive pieces. Instead of being flat, I give the clay on top a rounded edge so it blends in better with the head. I used sandpaper on both areas so the surface wouldn't be as rough. The face was honestly a bit hard to draw. I mean, it's basically just a smiley face, but in the game, just like his body, his face sort of twitches and rarely stays symmetrical. This is also where I ditched my original idea to make his face look like in the title card for the boss battle, because in the title card he has angry looking eyes, and that's something he never has in the actual game. So once again I'm using a knife, this time to carve out the face. I'm constantly flipping it over so I can create a path from both directions, so I don't accidentally chop off a big chunk in the wrong place. Because that would be stupid. I measured the arms to be around the length of his body from the neck down. I drilled a hole on both sides and tried to set the arms in the right positions. The pieces of tape you can see on the wire are just to keep track of which arm goes where. Just like in the beginning of the video, I covered up the metal surface on the arms to make sure the clay gets a good hold. Only this time I used tape instead of paper mache since the area is so small. I used some more sandpaper to smoothen it out, then I glued down the arms using a mixture of super glue and hobby glue. I used a bit of both because the super glue takes a while to set while the hobby glue only takes a few minutes. I think I put the arms too far up, because he's supposed to hold them up in a menacing way, but it looks more like he's just really excited to have hands. I made some fingers with the help of wire and tiny bits of clay. I tried using just steel wire, but they kept falling off before the glue could dry. This doesn't look extremely stable either, but as long as they stay on while I add more clay, it's good enough. I'm being careful to not rip off one of the fingers while doing this. I realized I couldn't add clay to one finger at a time, so I'm pretty much just covering the whole hand. Then I'm using my tools to make the distinction between the two fingers. I bought these tools for like $2 online and they actually did a pretty good job, but when it came to doing stuff the tools couldn't quite reach, I switched to using a regular toothpick. Now I'm done with the actual character, so before I move on to making the platform, I'm just sanding down any remaining rough areas on the arms and the hands. Obviously this figure can't stand on its own, so I'm gonna attach it to a small platform. I used a piece of wood and marked out the center so I could drill a hole for where the character will be.
Oh.
And of course I'm using more super glue to attach it. I'm trying to make sure it's covering all areas so it doesn't budge or crack. But I did have to go back later anyways and add a bit more, because it did budge a little bit. Now we can see how this is starting to come together. These final details is going to focus a lot on trying to make the stand look more like the ground in Subcon Forest, so I'm making some grass by covering the platform with clay. This time I'm not sanding it down, so it gets to keep this rugged surface. It will also provide extra support to make sure the character is kept in place. I used a sponge to make the grass texture. I've never actually tried this before myself, but I've seen other people do it and it seemed to work. I pressed down the sponge gently so it gets a bit of a rugged look instead of just a solid green. I switched between brighter and darker shades until I got the look I was going for. As I got closer to the center, I switched to using a paintbrush since I didn't want to get green paint on the character. To add a bit more scenery, I used some small lumps of clay to make some rocks. I used sandpaper to make the edges more defined, then I painted them grey. After the paint dried, I started gluing the rocks on one by one. I'm not trying to replicate a specific part of the forest, I'm just kinda making things up as I go, so I just placed them evenly across the platform. As a final touch, I made some tiny little white flowers like the ones in the forest entrance. Finally, we can begin painting the actual character. I was actually looking online to see if I could use some glow-in-the-dark paint for the eyes. It would have been cool, but it turns out the color would have looked more green unless it was dark, so I decided to use regular acrylic. I had to repaint the body several times because I couldn't really find the right look. The acrylic paint gets just a tiny bit darker after drying, so the dark purple I used became almost a pitch black. I tried again and it got way too bright. I probably did like 5 coatings back and forth, and in the end I made the body dark, but I added some brighter highlights in the front to show some contrast. And finally, what would the Snatcher be without a little contract? Thank you so much for watching, guys. It's been quite a long time since my last video, and I'm really sorry about that. I've been working quite a lot lately, and I sort of got into a productive slope that I'm still kind of trying to get out of. But anyways, if you have any ideas for future projects, you can leave them in the comment section below, and as always, take care, stay awesome, and I'll see you all next time.